H.Res. 1366, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Speaker, and I yield myself as such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak in support of H.Res. 1366, recognizing and honoring the United States freight rail industry. Before I do, I must note once again, as other of my colleagues have, that every single transportation bill on today's suspension calendar is a Democratic bill. The majority has not been living up to the common practice of a 70-30 split on those suspension calendars. Although currently it's running at about 95 to 5%, although I am pleased to say that they've added 3 Republican suspension bills to the calendar later this week. So I hope the majority will continue to try to honor that common practice we've had in the House for a number of years. We are honoring the freight rails today because our freight rail network is the undisputed envy of the world. Every year, freight trains move 40 tons of material for every man, woman, and child in this country. Railroads provide a remarkable public benefit, reducing traffic on the highways, lowering pollution, and providing a less expensive mode of transit for freight. And this public benefit is provided at no expense to taxpayers. Perhaps the greatest thing about the railroad industry is that it utilizes private money rather than public funds to build and maintain its infrastructure. Investors risk billions of capital annually to support the nation's railroads because these private companies produce a reliable, although modest return to investors. We must not jeopardize this critical industry by over-regulating or re-regulating and creating an environment where railroads cannot access the capital to maintain and expand their operations. Without this access to investment capital, the industry will decline as it has in the past. And we don't want to be here 10 or 15 years from now discussing taxpayer subsidies to the freight rail industry. Over the course of the 20th century, Congress enacted policies that nearly ruined the railroads in the name of reducing shipping rates. These policies discouraged investors and led to decay in the railroad industry. Standing derailments became common in this dark era, a term railroaders used for an idle freight car that simply collapses on its side because of rotten tracks. Over 1/5 of the nation's railroads were owned by bankrupt firms by the end of the 1970s. But the Staggers Reform Act in 1980 created an environment that has led to the revitalized freight network we all benefit from today. Railroads are prosperous again. Productivity has soared, and rail continues to gain market share thanks to improvements in service and competitive pricing. This renaissance culminated earlier this year when Warren Buffett made his $34 billion investment in the BNSF Railroad. Despite the fact that shipping rates are much lower today than they were in the 1980s, and freight rates in the U.S. are half of what they are in Europe and Japan, the same forces are at play that nearly destroyed the railroads in the 20th century. Already the urge to regulate has led to a policy that will force the railroads to spend more than $12 billion in positive train control, a price tag that continues to grow at an alarming rate. Positive train control has a cost-benefit ratio of 20-to-1 and will prevent less than 3% of rail accidents. It is my belief that railroads themselves are the best judge of where to invest capital dollars for safety improvements, not Congress. We should work together with the railroads to identify areas of safety improvement that can be accomplished at a reasonable cost. And I believe we should re-examine the scope of the positive train control mandate. I note that this is the first time that Congress has considered a resolution recognizing and honoring the freight railroads alone. I think that's very appropriate because the National Train Day resolution we passed earlier this year was changed from previous year's versions to focus solely on Amtrak and passenger rail. Amtrak operates primarily on private freight tracks. Without the continued economic vitality of freight railroads and their constant investment in maintaining 140,000 miles of track in the U.S., Amtrak would not have a national passenger rail system. In closing, I urge my colleagues to support H. Resolution 1366 and believe that Congress should honor the freight rail industry by working to create an environment that will allow it to have continued success. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois.